Okay, let's see if I
By the way,
can do this.
This is for my class. Not if you're not in my class, ignore me.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. So I'm going to start. Can everybody hear me? Just make sure. Okay. So I'm going to start with committing two mortal sins. I'm going to start telling a story. It's kind of a joke, but I'm going to first explain the joke and secondly apologize for it. So, everybody room. So I'm going to apologize because it's a joke that I would imagine that most of you will not get. And then explaining the joke is telling you why you're not going to get it. But I'm still going to tell it. So there are these two guys, and every Saturday, every Sabbath, they would meet at the synagogue and study Talmud. For years and years and years. They'd study literature, and this is a practice that Jews do. And they just studied different tractates. They went through almost the whole Babylonian Talmud over many, many years. One Saturday, one guy turns to his friend and says, well, I want you to come to the synagogue next week because, my son is getting bar mitzvah. He's becoming 13. He's going to be brought into the community. And I want to give you an honor. I want you to be called up to the Torah when the Torah is read, when the Bible is read from the community. I want you to be called up to the Torah and, make blessings in honor of my son's bar mitzvah. So the other guy says, well, that's very nice. Thank you so much. But I have to tell you, there's a problem because I'm not Jewish. He says, you're not Jewish? But we've been studying Talmud here in the synagogue for 30 years. He says, yeah, well, I like studying Talmud. He says, well, but it's a serious problem. You're well versed in Jewish law. And you know that if non-Jews keep the law, keep all of the law, it's a serious problem. He says, oh, don't worry about it. I don't keep all the law. He says, well, how do you not keep all the law? He says, well, I carry to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and you're not allowed to carry. He says, what do you mean you're not allowed to carry? There's an eruv, a special loophole, to be able to carry to the synagogue on Shabbos. He says, that loophole is made by people who I don't trust, and I don't think it's a good loophole. That's the joke. It really kills in Shul on Shabbos, believe me. Okay, so now, why didn't you get the joke? Because of the many layers of cultural knowledge needed in order to get the joke. So the joke is about, basically, so the first level is you have to know Jewish law. You have to know a little bit about contemporary Jewish law. So in Jewish law, one of the prohibitions of the Sabbath is this pillar is going to kill me, right? I'm looking straight ahead at, a camera, there you go. Okay, so Jewish law, one of the prohibitions of the Sabbath is that one is not allowed to carry from inside one's house outside into the public domain. Unless there is a wall around the city, and if there's no wall, there's a way to make a pseudo-wall. So Los Angeles, if you're actually interested, there's a website which talks about, it has the largest of these pseudo-walls, it's called an eruv, which makes the whole city into kind of a private domain that belongs to everybody. Which is a wonderful contradiction in terms, but that's what law is for. So the second thing you have to know is that people who study the Talmud together on a regular basis are usually part of the more religious segments of the population, more ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox. And in that community, they are mistrustful of other parts of the community. So not everybody trusts this pseudo wall that goes around, and one of the hallmarks of the more Orthodox folks is that they don't trust it. So the joke is that this person who is not Jewish at all, and therefore doesn't have any of the obligations, has taken on the affectations not only of the Orthodox, but of the ultra-Orthodox. So why do I tell you this whole thing? Why did I bore you for the last 5 minutes or so telling you a joke that I knew you wouldn't get and then apologizing for it? Because it's all about what cultural knowledge you need to understand a story. And that's where we're going to start, with a story. A story that you probably all know or might all know, but a story which I want you to look at anew. So this is a story of Jesus and the students and the Sabbath in the grain fields. So here's the story. At that time, and this is from Matthew. We're in the end of the first century, more or less. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here, and if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Okay. So what's this story about? This is the part where you raise your hands and say stuff. Or not. Come on, help me out here. I just told a really bad joke. Yes?
The disciples are hungry, so Jesus allows them to pick grain from the field, and it's typically looked down upon because of the Sabbath, and they usually shouldn't do that sort of thing.
Great. Okay, what's your name?
Michael.
Michael. Okay. Excellent. Good paraphrase of the story. Jesus comes with his disciples. They're hungry. Jesus allows them to pick grain even though it's the Sabbath, and they normally don't do that. And the Pharisees come along and yell at them. Who are the Pharisees? Teachers of the law. Okay. Good. All right. Anything else? What kind of arguments is Jesus making?
Historical one.
Okay, say more. Historical.
He uses the example of David.
Okay, so an argument from precedent. See, David, when David was running away from Saul and was in danger of being killed, and so he was hungry, went into the temple and demanded food, and ate and gave his men to eat, or his actually young boys to eat. And so he says, Jesus says, see, David did it, so we could do it. What else? Okay. I know you didn't come here thinking that you'd have to do any work. So he makes three arguments, right? The first argument is the argument from David, which is perhaps an argument from historical precedent. The second argument is have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? What this means is that in the temple, sacrifices are brought on the Sabbath. And in order to bring a sacrifice, you have to light fire. You have to burn the sacrifice. You have to cook the meat, as it were, on the altar. And so that's not considered guilty. That's not considered a sin. Not only is it not considered a sin, but it's actually an obligation to do that. And finally, he says, if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. So the final argument is that who's the Son of Man? There you go, Jesus, is the Lord of the Sabbath. What kind of argument is that?
Divine overriding argument. If he's God, then you can't say no.
Okay, so if Jesus is God, if he is the Son of Man, right, and here he seems to be claiming to be, or the author of the story putting in his mouth that he's claiming to be, right, so then the law is subject to the whim of God, right, and so the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Right, so oftentimes this is one of the stories, and the story of the healing, and the story are seen as stories of where Jesus overrides, contravenes the law for some other reason. What do we need to know to make this story make sense? Because what right now does not make sense? Well, first of all, what is the law of the Sabbath? Right? What do we know about the Sabbath? Secondly, what is the connection between the temple and the Sabbath? Why does he choose the example of the temple? Why not something else? Right? Why is it so important? Why is that relevant to what's going on here? And finally, what is the connection with him being the Son of Man, with Jesus being Son of Man, and therefore Lord of the Sabbath? Right? It's not just the Son of the Man. It's not just the Son of Man decides what laws to keep and what laws not to keep, but the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Okay. So those are the questions which we're going to have in the back of our mind. And we're going to take a look at the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, specifically the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to hallow. All right, does somebody want to read? Just so I don't hear myself talking the whole time. You've seen this before. Somebody? All right, I'll read. Remember the Sabbath day to hallow. So now on the right-hand side, so if you look back here, so the left-hand side is Exodus, the right-hand side is Deuteronomy. There are two versions of the Ten Commandments, which I'm sure you all know. The left-hand side is the Exodus version, the right-hand side is the Deuteronomy version. The bolded parts are that which is different between the two. And then there's lots of other information which is important, but for now we're going to ignore it. Okay, so we'll start with the left-hand side. Remember the Sabbath day to hallow it. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of Yahweh your God. You shall not do any work, you and your son and your daughter, your male and your female slave, and your cattle, and the stranger who is in your settlements. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in it, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Okay, so we have a number. We get a little bit of information, a little bit more information. You don't have to be nervous. I'm not going to call you anymore. We gather a little information about the Sabbath, what was prohibited on the Sabbath, but we also get a reason for the Sabbath. Now, the reason for the Sabbath here is that 6 days God made heaven and the earth and all that is in them, and God rested on the seventh day. How do we know that? Where do we know that before? It's in Genesis, right? Genesis, the beginning of Genesis 2, God finished making the heavens and the earth. God rested on the seventh day, stopped doing work. There are two verbs that are used about God. Nacha, he rested, and Shabbat, he stopped. Vayinafash, and he ensouled the world. Right? So in 6 days God made heaven and earth and all that is in them. He rested on the seventh day. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Interestingly enough, we go over to Deuteronomy, the other version of the Ten Commandments, and we find something different. Observe the Sabbath day to hallow it, as God your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of God your God. You shall not do any work, and your son and your daughter, and your male and your female slave, and your ox and your ass, and all your cattle, and stranger who is in your settlements, more or less the same till then, but so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. You must remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore, Yahweh your God has commanded you to make the Sabbath day. So it's very different. The Sabbath day doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the 6 days of creation and the seventh day of rest. Sabbath day has to do rather with the exodus from Egypt, with slavery. And also the other problem, the other interesting thing about this, the challenge with it is that it says, therefore God commanded you to make the Sabbath day, as if there's a logical connection between freedom from slavery and celebrating the Sabbath, or preserving the Sabbath. So there's one interesting historical connection. There are some people who say that the word Sabbath comes from an Akkadian word sabbatu, or sapatu, which referred to an ancient once a month or twice a month festival on which slaves were free. Not that they were free, but that they were free, so that there seems to be some connection. But as it's written here, we don't understand what's going on. So some of the commentaries will say, some of the rabbinic commentaries and later commentaries say, why is it that therefore God commanded you to make the Sabbath day? Because in Egypt, during the times of slavery, people couldn't keep the Sabbath. Right? Their time was not their own. They were enslaved. And so now, the people are free, they can keep the Sabbath. And there are many, there are several other commandments in which the reason is given, the rationale is given for, because of this, God commanded you to do this. For example, the tithing of the first animals and the redemption of the firstborn and other things. But those are much more directly connected. So what do we get about, what do we know? What information have we gotten about the Sabbath itself from these two laws? So we say you're not allowed to, there's positive things. Remember the Sabbath or observe the Sabbath. Zachor and Shamor, remember and observe the Sabbath. It's not actually clear how to do that, but there it is. Don't do work. And we get a little bit about what the work means, especially in Deuteronomy, that you shouldn't do work, and your ox and your ass and your cattle and stranger, and everybody must rest, even your slaves. So some part of Sabbath is about giving everybody a day off from work. Now, what we're going to do is take a jump forward, bow, if, let's say, 700 years. Conservative. And we're going to go to Mishnah, Shabbat. Mishnah is the cornerstone text of the rabbinic tradition. It was edited sometime in the early 3rd century. It is the first book, I tell my students, which is a Jewish book. What does that mean? It means the Bible, though written by people, many of whom would become Jews, was not a Jewish book. If you look in the Bible and try to figure out what to do as a Jew, you end up in trouble. The Bible has, there are two major religions who have an equal claim on the Bible, Judaism and Christianity, and Islam has a different, more oblique claim on the Bible. And so this book, Mishnah, is the first Jewish book, and it's, some people think of it as a code. It's not clear to this day what it is, but this is Mishnah Shabbat. Mishnah Shabbat, the 7th chapter of Mishnah Shabbat, the 2nd Mishnah, that's Shabbat 7:2. And here we start straight off. The main classes of activity are 40 save one. Now already you have to know that the main class of activity mean the main classes of forbidden activity. Right? When it said back in the Decalogue that you shall not do any work, here work is being defined as follows. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, winnowing, cleansing crops, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, washing or beating or dyeing it, spinning, weaving, making loops, weaving threads, separating two threads, tying a knot, loosening a knot, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches, hunting a gazelle, slaughtering or flaying or salting it, curing its skin, scraping it, cutting it up, writing 2 letters, erasing in order to write 2 letters, building, pulling down, pulling out fire, putting out fire, lighting a fire, striking with a hammer and taking out aught from one domain to another. Remember that. There'll be a test. Just kidding. Okay. So, what's going on here? We had, a minute ago, we just had 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, and the 7th day you shouldn't do any work, and now all of a sudden we have 39 categories of work. So what else do we know about the Sabbath? Something must have happened from here to here. So we have a couple of other things about the Sabbath in the Bible. We have Exodus 34:21. 6 days you shall labor, but on the 7th you shall rest. Even during the plowing season and the harvest you must rest. So apparently plowing and harvesting is something you can't do on the Sabbath. Exodus 16. Bear in mind the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day gives you bread for 2 days. This commandment comes in the middle of the story of the manna from heaven. The manna came down. God said you'll get 2 portions of manna on Friday, so therefore don't collect on Saturday. Everyone is to stay where they are, and the 7th day no one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. So here we have perhaps another commandment. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out. And we have Exodus 35. Do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. And Numbers 15, where we might have an obligation, at least we learn it from this wonderful little story. While the Israelites were in the wilderness, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath. Those who found him brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly, and they kept him in custody because it wasn't clear what they should do. Then Moses looked up to God. It's good to have a direct line. The Lord said to Moses, the man must die. The whole assembly must stone him outside the camp. The assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death as the Lord commanded Moses. So it's not healthy to collect wood on the Sabbath. And finally, it's not finally, there are a couple other more things, but nothing that really will help us that much more. But here Jeremiah, in ranting against the Jews, Jeremiah is often ranting, says, this is why he's ranting. In verse 21, this is what the Lord says, be careful not to carry a load on the Sabbath day or bring it through the gates of Jerusalem. Do not bring a load out of your houses or do any work on the Sabbath, but keep the Sabbath day holy as I commanded your ancestors. So it seems that there's some sort of prohibition against carrying a load on the Sabbath to bring it through the gates of Jerusalem. The problem here is it's not clear what that means. When looking at it through rabbinic eyes, it could be a problem just to carry something in the public domain, but if we look at it just as it is, then it could be because of the fact that why would somebody bring a load into the gates of Jerusalem? To sell it, right? To bring it to the marketplace. And it could be that what Jeremiah is worried about is commerce rather than anything else. So it's even from this, where with this almost what seems to be a direct prohibition, it's not clear what it means. So what do we have? What do we know about the Sabbath? We know that you're not allowed to work. I'm not sure exactly what that means. We know that you shouldn't light a fire. You shouldn't go out. You shouldn't carry a load. And you should remember or observe the Sabbath to hallow it. So if we follow the biblical Sabbath, there was this guy who wrote a book, A Year of Living Biblically. If you follow a biblical Sabbath, you basically sit in your house in the dark and cold and remember that it's the Sabbath. So how did we get from there to 39 categories of work? All right. So a couple of steps between here and there. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, we find that in addition to the Sabbath prohibitions that we had up until now, another one popped up, which is fascinating, which we don't hear about in any of the in the Bible, any of the biblical stories, which is the prohibition against fighting on the Sabbath. So the enemy hastened to attack them, but they did not answer them or hurl a stone at them or block up their hiding places. For they said, let us all die in our innocence. Heaven and earth testify for us that you are killing us unjustly. So they attacked them on the Sabbath, and they died with their wives and children and cattle to the number of 1,000 persons. When Mattathias and his friends learned about it, they mourned for them deeply. So there seems to have been, and this is the story of the rebels against the Greeks in the 2nd century before the Common Era, and they were attacked on the Sabbath and refused to fight. And they refused to fight, and so they were all killed. Then Mattathias, who's the general, who's the head guy, and his friends learned about it, and they mourned deeply for them. And each said to his neighbor, if we all do as our brethren have done and refuse to fight with the Gentiles for our lives and our ordinances, they will quickly destroy us from the earth. So it's not actually a very good strategic decision to announce to everybody that you're not fighting on the Sabbath, because then when will people attack you? On the Sabbath. Okay. So they made this decision that day. Let us fight against every man who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. Let us not die as our brethren died in their hiding places. And so from this moment on, apparently, they made a distinction between defensive fighting and offensive fighting, or defensive fighting and other kinds of things. So therefore we find in places around in other literature that they would fight back if attacked, but they wouldn't build ramparts, or they wouldn't attack an enemy who was building ramparts to attack them. And we see this also in Josephus, when they would not comply with their persuasion, but continued. Josephus is writing in the 1st century. Josephus was around during the destruction of the temple in 70 in the Common Era. Josephus wrote in Greek. He was a Jewish general, and then at the right time, he switched sides and became a recorder of the fall of the Jewish Empire, and then wrote the history of the Jews when he got back to Rome. When they would not comply with their persuasions but continued to be of a different mind, they fought against them on the Sabbath day, and they burnt them as they were in the caves without resistance, without so much as stopping up the entrance of the caves. And they avoided to defend themselves on that day because they were not willing to break in upon the honor of the old Sabbath, even in such distresses. For our law requires that we rest upon that day. There were about 1,000 with their wives and children who were smothered and died in these caves. But many of those that escaped joined themselves to Mattathias and appointed him to be their ruler. So you see, he was writing about more or less the same story, but talking about the fact that, again, that still there was no defensive war on the Sabbath until that time, and then afterwards, this rule on the bottom continues among us to say that if there be a necessity, we may fight on the Sabbath day. So, in addition to sitting in your house in the dark, eating cold food, and remembering this, the Sabbath, you're also not allowed to fight with anybody. So that's one way that the Sabbath could have gone, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the scrolls we have from the Dead Sea, the Damascus Covenant, and the scroll, the Qumran Covenant, the Seraph, also describe a series of prohibitions on the Sabbath. There was another way to go, which was articulated and described by Philo of Alexandria. Philo of Alexandria lived in Alexandria in the 1st century before the Common Era, was a philosopher and an observant Jew, but he stood on the cusp between, in the Jewish world, between those who thought, who were complete allegorists. Let's take a step back. Within Greek religion, within the Hellenistic world, the way that philosophers dealt with parts of the religion that they didn't think that seemed to be problematic was that they saw them as allegories of truth. Right? This started back with the scholars of Homer and the Greek gods, but then also within Judaism, a lot of the philosophers saw the various laws and rituals as actually pointing towards larger truths. So, for example, the Sabbath is on the 7th day, and the 7 is a number within the philosophical tradition, which is that Philo was part of, that is beyond nature. Right? The Sabbath points to the soul. The Sabbath is the day on which the soul refurbishes itself or renews itself. And so what the Sabbath is actually about is about the obligation for every person to think themselves towards a better path, to reflect on what they've done and move forward. Now, there are some people in the community in Alexandria who said, okay, we know that, so you don't actually have to practice. We don't actually have to keep the Sabbath, because we know that all the observances point towards what we're supposed to do with our soul. We're supposed to reflect, we're supposed to meditate, we're supposed to think about God, we're supposed to think philosophical thoughts, think about truth. And therefore, we know that because we're philosophers, so we don't have to stay at home and not do any of the, and follow all the prohibitions. So Philo, and they did that with lots, they did that with circumcision, and they talked about with tzitzit and prayer. All the commandments had philosophical analogs, and therefore, there was this community in Alexandria who said we don't have to actually observe these observances. We can just understand their philosophical significance and then just do what philosophically they're supposed to do. Philo was part of a group who said, no, we can't do that. Philo actually held the Sabbath in great reverence and esteem, and held all the commandments in great reverence and esteem, because for Philo, they were the outward guardian of an inward state. You couldn't just, Philo had actually 3 reasons. The reason I want to go into this is because the Sabbath becomes, and later this is going to be true also when we get back to the story of Jesus and his disciples, the Sabbath becomes a crux in which lots of other disputes are played out. So Philo had 3 reasons for observing the Sabbath. The first was an argument for authority, that those who set the laws were greater than us. The second was observing the Sabbath laws as a way of living as a Jew in a Jewish society, and not observing those laws, even for good philosophical reasons, would bring censure upon those who do observe the laws but argue for a philosophical interpretation of them. What that basically meant is that within the Jewish community there were those who didn't think that the philosophical way was the way to go, and so therefore those who would not observe the laws but just understand the philosophical import of them would bring censure upon those who also observed the law but understood them as philosophically important. And finally, and this was the most important reason for Philo, the observances are like the body to the soul of the philosophical or symbolic understanding. We need to care for the body as well as for the soul. And so the outward observances, the acts, as it were just as important as the inward understanding. Right? Because the practice actually was like the body to the soul, and the soul would be unanchored without the practice. And so Philo understood the seventh day as a day, the Sabbath day, as a day of reflection and study, as more important than just the prohibitions and the observances, but rather as something much deeper than that. So that's the other way that one could have gone. So back to Mishnah Shabbat 7.2. So now we're back to the rabbis. What is this list about? Well, actually, this list is not a random list, but it's actually a little bit different. So if we look at the list, actually, it's made up of 3 series and 2 add-ons, as it were. The first series is the series of baking. Right? It starts out at sewing, ends up at baking. Everything you have to do to make bread. The second series starts at shearing wool and ends with sewing clothes. So everything you need from shearing the wool, washing or beating it or dyeing it, to actually sewing and preparing garments. And the third one is about writing. Right? So it's everything from hunting to slaughtering, flaying, salting, curing, scraping, cutting, writing 2 letters, preparing parchment for the reason of writing 2 letters or erasing in order to write 2 letters. So the 3 major activities are represented here. The first is baking, food. The second is making clothes. And for the rabbis, who are a scribal class, the third most important activity is writing books. And the central book that's being written is the Torah itself. And finally, there are 2 opposites, 2 binaries, building and pulling down, and putting out a fire and lighting a fire. Which basically, once I was in graduate school and I was reading work by Manuel Levinas and work by Manuel Sartre, and I'm forgetting Sartre's first name. Jean-Paul Sartre. Manuel Levinas and Jean-Paul Sartre. And Levinas's book is called Totality and Infinity, and Sartre's book was oh my God. There you go. Get to my age, you'll see. You laugh now. Right? And then a friend of mine walked by and said, well, that seems to cover it all. So building and tearing down, lighting a fire and putting out a fire seems to cover it all. Right? And finally, taking something out from one domain to another. So rather than just being a random list, these are actually 3 stylized lists plus kind of overall statements. Though, and then the other important thing in terms of the literary construction of this Mishnah is it starts the main class of activity of 40 save 1 and it ends the main class of activities of 40 save 1. And this is a scribal, this is something we know from the Bible called a resumptive repetition. It's a scribal practice that when a scribe is adding something in or is commenting on something, they repeat the verse before the addition and then put it again at the end. So what probably happened here is that they had the number 40, 40 save 1, which is a number that is repeated often, that's used often. It's one of those numbers in rabbinic literature. It's one of those numbers in the Bible. 40 years in the desert, In Judges, 40 years of peace and then 40 years of bad. It's one of those numbers. So 40 save 1 is called 40 save 1 because 40 is one of those numbers. And so they probably had as a tradition that there are 40 save 1 forbidden activities. And then the forbidden activities that they came up with was because these were activities that covered everything. So basically when they said the main class of activity of 40 save 1, what are those activities? Everything. Right? Don't do stuff. Do not do stuff. However, once they came up with these activities, they had to come up with a reason for these activities. So what is the reason for these activities? And this brings us back to the question about why temple came into the story. In the middle of the instructions that God gives to Moses in Exodus 35 for constructing the tabernacle, we have these 3 verses. And Moses gathered the whole Israelite community and said to them, these are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. For 6 days work is to be done, but the 7th day shall be your holy day, a day of Sabbath rest to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it is to be put to the death. Do not light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. The Mechilta, which is an early midrash, it's a 5th century midrash, a 5th century commentary on Exodus, says the following. And Moses gathered the people, right? Remember Moses, verse 1, and Moses gathered the whole Israelite community. Why is this section set forth? Those you have basically this instruction on how to build a tabernacle, and all of a sudden you're giving me Sabbath laws. Because it says, and let them make me a sanctuary. Earlier in Exodus, when God gives the initial command to make a sanctuary, it says, let them make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell amongst them. I might understand it to mean either on weekdays or on the Sabbath. When am I supposed to make the sanctuary? All the time. And to what am I to apply? Everyone that profaneth shall surely be put to death. So what do I get from the fact that actually if you do work on the Sabbath, you get killed? And actually, if anybody asks you what it says most about, this is one of those cocktail party trivia, which nobody ever says at cocktail parties. But, what does it say more about the Sabbath in the Bible than anything else? You shall be put to death. A lot of you shall be put to death. So what does it mean that it says, everyone that profaneth shall be put to death? Other kinds of work except work on the sanctuary. So I understand that every other word that you can be put to death for doing forbidden activity except for work on the sanctuary. Perhaps, however, the rabbis say, it applies even to work on the sanctuary. Maybe also I'm allowed to do work on the sanctuary. However, how am I to maintain and let them make me a sanctuary? But it says in the verse, let them make me a sanctuary. It doesn't say let them make me a sanctuary Sunday through Friday. On all other days but the Sabbath. Perhaps however it means even the Sabbath. No, not given up. Maybe it means also on the Sabbath. For the following argument might be advanced. If the temple service, which can be carried out only by means of the preparations, sets aside the laws of Sabbath. In other words, if the sacrifices, which you can only do the sacrifices if you prepare for them, and those things that you have to prepare by gathering wood, by lighting fires, by slaughtering, by flaying, all that kind of stuff, set aside the laws of Sabbath. Is it not logical that the preparations for this service, without which no service is possible, in other words, building the tabernacle, should set aside laws of Sabbath? I might therefore think that if the horn of the altar is broken off, or if the knife became defective, it is permitted to repair these on the Sabbath. In other words, if I'm making the tabernacle and part of the altar falls apart, so I think that it's prepared for Sabbath. Therefore, in setting forth this section, Moses gathered Scripture teaches that even such work is to be done only on weekdays, but not on the Sabbath. And so the rabbis learn from this that the work, or they claim that the work that was needed for the Sabbath, for the work that was needed to create the tabernacle, is the works that are prohibited for the Sabbath. So everything that comes up to baking, because we need the shewbread. Everything that comes up to making clothes, because we need the vestments of the priests. Everything that comes up to writing, because we have to write the Torah scroll, which the high priest has. And of course, building and taking apart, lighting fires and putting out fires. That is basically the activity that goes on. And taking something from one domain to another, because that's carrying is how the tabernacle itself was brought from one place to another. It was taken apart and put back together. And so we finally get back to the story in Matthew, which also appears in Mark in a little different form, and in Luke. Except now the story is told by the rabbis. Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Elazar, the son of Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva, three of the great sages of the first generation, lived in the first century, lived in the beginning of the second century, were walking on the way, and Levi Hasadar and Rabbi Ishmael, the son of Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Azariah, two other sages, were walking behind them. And the question arose among them, from whence do we know that the saving of a life supersedes the Sabbath? So they asked, how do we know that? Basically the same question. How do we know that the saving of a life is more important than the Sabbath? Rabbi Ishmael answered, behold, it says, if a thief is caught breaking in and is struck so that he dies, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, he is guilty of bloodshed. The law in Exodus 22, 2-3, that if somebody is breaking into somebody's house at night, then you're allowed to kill them, because the assumption is that if somebody's breaking into the house at night, then they're desperate enough to kill you. And this is true even if we are not sure whether he came to kill or only steal. Now, the reasoning is from the light to the heaven. This is a type of logical reasoning that the rabbis always use. Just as the killing of a person which pollutes the land and pushes the divine presence away supersedes the Sabbath, in such a case of one caught at night breaking and entering, even more so the saving of a life. Okay? Just as the killing of a person which pollutes the land and pushes the divine presence away supersedes the Sabbath. Meaning, if somebody breaks into your house on the Sabbath, you're allowed to kill them, even though killing pollutes the land and pushes the divine presence away. So even the more, so they say, so if that's okay, right, that's an unfortunate, tragic situation, somebody breaks into your house, you're allowed to kill them, even though it's going to despoil the land and push away the divine presence. So how much the more so to save a life on the Sabbath should push away the law? Rabbi Eliezer spoke up with a different answer. Just as circumcision, which saves only one member of a person, supersedes the Sabbath, the entire body even more so. You have to do circumcise on the 8th day. And circumcising on the 8th day, even though cutting a person's body, drawing blood, is prohibited, still, you're allowed to do it on the Sabbath. So much the more so, that only saves one part of a person's body, so much the more so when you save the entire body. And Rabbi Akiva says, if murder supersedes the temple worship, which supersedes the Sabbath, saving a life even more so. So meaning that if somebody is a murderer, and he comes and he tries to find sanctuary in the temple, the Torah says you drag him out even if he's hanging onto the altar. So that supersedes the temple worship, because you're basically defiling the temple worship, going in and dragging somebody out, which supersedes the Sabbath, saving a life even more so. Finally, Rabbi Yossi, two more. When Rabbi Yossi says, when it says, but keep my Sabbaths, and here start paying attention, but keep my Sabbaths, the word but makes a distinction. There are Sabbaths that you push aside, and Sabbaths that you keep. Right? So the but keep my Sabbaths, the aval, the but keep my Sabbaths in the Torah, tells us that some Sabbaths you put aside. So what Sabbaths you put aside? The ones where you're saving a life. And Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh says something which we will now recognize. Behold, it says, keep the Sabbath, because it is holy to you. To you the Sabbath is delivered, and not you to the Sabbath. Rabbi Natan says, the children of Israel kept the Sabbath to keep the Sabbath to their generations, profane one Sabbath for him, the sick person, in order that he may keep many Sabbaths. And so here we get back to the logic we had in the first story. That the Sabbath is delivered is for you, and you are not for the Sabbath. So in a case where life is in danger, you of course abrogate the Sabbath. Or it says the children of Israel kept the Sabbath to keep their Sabbath for generations. So the reading this strongly as they kept the Sabbath in order to be able to keep the Sabbath for their generations. So you profane one Sabbath for a person who's sick in order that that person might keep the Sabbath for many other years. And so when we go back, we see what was the rhetoric that Jesus was involved in. It was a rabbinic dispute. It was an internal dispute. It wasn't a dispute between Christians and Jews. It was when the Pharisees came to Jesus as a rabbi, they said, what are you doing? And he said, well, I have an argument. Why have you not read what David did? Right? David also, when he was hungry and needed food, he too ate from the temple even. Right? Because we know that saving a life supersedes temple law, as we just saw. Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath? There is service that's done in the temple which overrides Sabbath law. So therefore, here too, when you're saving a life, you override Sabbath law. And finally, I desire, if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And here's a little bit of a side snarky comment that Jesus is saying, but Isaiah, remember Isaiah? Isaiah said, what's more important? What's more important is mercy and not sacrifice. You would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. But the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, is just what we saw, right? Is that the Sabbath is given to you, so therefore, in order to save your life, you're allowed to, you can abrogate the Sabbath. Finally, with Jesus' snarky comment, Isaiah actually says, in Isaiah 58, which is the classic chapter of Isaiah saying, are these the fasts that you want? Is this the kind of fasting you've chosen? Just sitting and not eating and shaking back and forth and wearing sackcloth and ashes? No, this is the kind of fast that I've chosen, to loosen the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Now, if you read just the first part of the chapter, you think that Isaiah is just kicking out ritual. But at the end of the chapter, he says, in verse 13, if you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath, from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight, the Lord's honor, the holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going on your way and not doing as you please or speak idle words, then you will find joy in the Lord. So it's not. And this, Jesus wasn't by saying, you don't understand what it means that the Lord wants mercy and not sacrifice. Jesus wasn't saying get rid of the law. Jesus was actually involved in an internal argument. We all know what the law is. We all know what the laws of the Sabbath are, what the prohibitions of the Sabbath are, what the purpose of the Sabbath is. But we also both know, saying to the rabbis, that the Sabbath is less important than saving human life. And so the Sabbath is less important than saving human life. So therefore, if they're hungry and have to eat, then they have to break the Sabbath in order to be able to keep many more Sabbaths. Now, the radical thing about this, therefore, is not abrogating the Sabbath. The radical thing about this is the claim of authority. So when the rabbis say it, they say that this actually is what the Torah means. When Jesus says it, or at least the way Matthew has Jesus say it, Jesus makes a claim to be the Son of Man, that it's his authority rather than authority he's deriving from Torah. But aside from that, the argument that Jesus has here is an internal rabbinic argument with those who see him and his students. So I got questions, comments.
So, fire away with questions. I'll repeat them so that the camera can hear them, and it'll give you a chance to think about your answer. Okay. So what kind of questions do you have for Professor Cohen regarding the Sabbath, Jesus' remarks in comparison with all these other texts? And there are many, many more. Yeah.
In the Jewish tradition, I noticed that sometimes they have like Friday night services. Is that considered Sabbath?
Okay, so our Friday night service is considered Sabbath. So, explain.
Excellent question. Tell me your name.
Michael.
Michael. I should know your name because you've been really good in participating. So yes, actually, yes. Friday night. In the way that the Jewish calendar is counted, the day starts the night before. Right? And this is actually one of the major disputes, which I'm sure you'll find out in one of your courses, is that in antiquity was about the calendar, right? Jubilees and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Everybody had when things came out during the year. There was a lunar cycle, there was a lunar calendar, a solar calendar, a solilunar calendar. But one of the big things for the rabbis, the day started the night before. So therefore, the Sabbath actually starts Friday night at sundown. Not that, but a day was 24 hours, but a night was always 12 hours, and a day was always 12 hours. So what that meant is that the hours were different at different times of the year. And there were just 12 parts of the night and 12 parts of the day.
Thank you.
And doesn't that go back to Genesis 1? Isn't that the argument?
The argument is right, exactly. The argument exactly. It's the first argument in the Talmud.
Interesting.
Would you say it's harder to practice the Sabbath in America versus in Israel?
So is it harder to practice the Sabbath in America than it would be in Israel?
Depends where you live, right? So Los Angeles, they said, Los Angeles, it's not really hard. If you're living in West LA, there's large Jewish communities. You're living in parts of in New York and Chicago, any major urban city that has a big Jewish community, it's actually not that hard. I mean, it's hard in the sense if you have a job and you have to. But if you're living in a small city like Malibu, if you're living in a small place in the Midwest, or then it's harder because you're basically. So here's the thing about the Sabbath. What the Sabbath laws do, and we didn't get into most of the rest of this, but what the Sabbath laws do is you create a map of the Sabbath, right? So basically what happens is that you have all these prohibitions, and what's the point is that once you have all these prohibitions, then you're doing God. Because what did God do on the seventh day? Nothing, right? So then everything that you do is a Sabbath activity, as long as you have the map of the prohibitions, where you're allowed to walk, where you're not allowed to walk, as long as you keep that in mind, then you have, so what you do then is in your map, you are living in a Sabbath world. So a Jew could be walking down the street right next door to a non-Jew, and they're having a conversation, and they're walking together and everything, but they're walking in two different spaces. Because the Jew is walking in Sabbath, and the non-Jew is not. The non-Jew doesn't have to, right? But so that's one of the beauties of the Sabbath, is that it creates an imaginary world, right, in which you are inhabiting. So everything you do, once you have this boundary of prohibitions, everything you do is Sabbath. Okay? So if you're doing it by yourself, Judaism is a very hard religion to practice alone. And if you're doing it by yourself without a community, it's very hard, right? Because not only just for the fact that you need quorum in the synagogue and have meals and stuff like that, but just for the fact that on Friday afternoon in winter the Sabbath starts at around 4 or 5 o'clock. You have to get out of work early. If nobody's doing that, then that's uncomfortable. You have what's your job, and where to get all kinds of other things, kosher food, all kinds of stuff like that. So it's harder to practice when there's no Jewish community. Yes.
What about activities that are physically, mentally demanding that you find relaxing? With that.
Do you want to repeat the question?
So what about activities that you find relaxing, but
or physically or mentally demanding?
Yeah.
That's a great question, right? Mentally demanding, not a problem. Physically demanding, it depends, because of this map, right? So, and this is, people who abide strictly by the law, so you're not allowed to, so for example, if you want to go bike riding, right? So, you can go a certain amount, but not beyond that, right? So if you're okay with bike riding in the city, that's not a problem. If you want to go mountain climbing, then that's a bigger problem, because you have to, take your stuff with you and go. But there is a prohibition against, it's not one of the 39, it's 39, but there is a prohibition against doing an excessive amount of work on the Sabbath, right? Expending too much energy, physical energy. It's not a problem at all to expend mental energy, right? Actually, that's lauded, to have deep philosophical conversations, to study.
Thank you.
Professor Cohen, I have a question.
Sorry.
I noticed the 40 save 1 list. There are lots of other things. Lots of other trades, work.
Correct.
So, are there other similar passages that
well, that's why
spell this out more, or is it just by implication that you have, what you can and cannot?
Yes, well, thank you for that. Because the 40 save 1 list is one, and that's why I pointed out, that's why I stressed the fact that it's a stylized list. And there are, lots more, tens more categories of things that are prohibited. So, for example, one of the major, one of the things that jumps out, it says baking is forbidden, but what about cooking? Right, cooking is obviously also forbidden. Well, obviously, to the rabbis, it's obviously also forbidden. So there are lots of things that are by analogy or by that are taken from this list, and there are other people who don't abide this. There are other rabbis in the Talmud who don't abide this list and have like 1,000 things, which is also hyperbolic, but lots of other things which are not. It depends on how you understand it. And this list, I think, the way I read it, is not consensus among scholars, but is a late list, right? Because I think here the Mishnah is later than the Tosefta. The Tosefta is the earlier compilation, and the Tosefta doesn't have a list. Right? It has the number, but doesn't have a list. And we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls they have other lists, and actually the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of things are stricter than the Rabbi. So there are, so yes, there are lots and lots more. And actually most of Tractate Shabbat, which is 180 some pages, is about figuring out what exactly these activities mean.
Because you want to know if you are...
Exactly, you want to know how not to.
Right.
And it's an interesting thing that Tractate Shabbat is mainly about what not to do. Right? There's very little, out of 180 something pages, there are about 5 pages about what to do. Right? Which is because of the fact that what you're doing is performing God, which is not doing anything on the seventh day.
Other questions? Drew?
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Cohen. A quick question about Christianity. As it has evolved, we've sort of adopted a different relationship to the law, obviously, which would result in some people looking at Judaism and its observance of Sabbath laws and other laws as petty in some ways, as overly sensitive to some of these ancient, legal requirements. How do you explain the relationship between how you observe the law, your own religious identity, what it means to you, being Jewish, and how do you connect that then, of course, to Christians, and how's that relate?
In 30 seconds. That's a great question. Did everybody hear the question? So yes. So there's to start all the way back in the split between Judaism and Christianity. A lot of scholarship that's a lot of the trend of a lot of scholarship over the last decade and more than that is actually characterized by the title of a book, a recent book, which is called "The Paths That Did Not Split," that did not separate. That the division between Judaism and Christianity happened much, much later than people originally thought. And so, as we saw here, Jesus is not arguing against Judaism. There was an internal debate between Jesus and some of the Pharisees. And so, what you're basically asking, more or less, is about supersessionism, right? And so, legal thinking is a certain type of relationship to the divine, which says that practices, which basically means working in the world, is an important way of creating holiness. The argument, the Christian argument, which is not, and actually evolved to be more of a Protestant argument than a Catholic argument, is that faith is the way to establish a relationship to God, which in a certain way bypasses the world. And so there's a bifurcation of world and God. And the way that Judaism has evolved in the ritual law, and actually more than just the ritual law, but the fact that Jewish law actually encompasses everything, every part of one's life, is claiming the material for God. It's claiming that the world itself, every part of the world, everything from business transactions to who you marry, how you have sex, to ritual practices, are divine. Because there's a way of thinking about it, right? And there are tools within which to think about it. And so that's my identity as a Jew, is within that tradition of the fact that I have to pay attention to everything I do. So if every time I eat something, if I have a snack, I have to make a blessing over it, what it says to me is that, for that split second, I say, oh, I'm actually eating something. And I'm actually doing something. I have some relationship to this. I'm getting nutrition from this. This comes from someplace. And, it's not, I'm not claiming that I'm the great mystic, but, this, every time you stop, it stops you in your tracks in what you're doing. If there's a way to conduct business and a way not to conduct business, it means that when, if I'm an investment banker and I go to work in the morning, then it's not just, then I'm not merely guided and obligated by the profits I have to make for shareholders, but also that there is a real notion of right and wrong which grounds this practice. And so that is what happens when you have a law-bound religion, as opposed to Christianity. Now, that doesn't mean, and one of the things that I'm involved in, as Professor Willis said before, is that I'm involved in a number of social justice movements. One of them is CLU, Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, which is an interfaith social justice organization. And so it doesn't at all mean that there's no common language, there's no way to work together, or that there's no mutual respect. It's just a different way to look at the world. Right? It's a different way to look at the world. And the truth is that in certain ways, what I've noticed for a lot of Christian social justice activists is that it's Jesus' actual being in the world which takes the place of ritual creating material divinity in the world. Right? So Jesus actually walked. So if God actually walked in the world and interacted with poor people, so there is a sanctity in that kind of interaction. Whereas in Judaism, it's actually the fact that that interaction is understood within the concept of a divine law that gives it a certain amount of value.
Any other burning questions? All right. Thank you very much. What's our next event?
Our next event is Tuesday. Sam Garner talking about the Jewish Jesus. And then on Thursday here, we've got a presentation on the Holocaust. So